Karen Taylor, and I'm Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is part of the Labor, Literature and Landmark Lecture Series. I would like to particularly thank Princeton Architectural Press for their assistance, and in particular, Wes Seeley. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a non-profitable organization that was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our 235-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John M. Mossman Lock Museum, and our lecture series, which was first started in 1837, and of course, of which tonight's lecture is part of. I want to make special mention that our General Society Library is currently celebrating its 200th anniversary. During the lecture, there will be an opportunity to submit typewritten questions through the Q&A section. At the end of the talk, we will answer as many of these questions as we can in our Q&A session. What goes on inside a paragraph of printed text? Tonight, Cyrus Highsmith will discuss his book, Inside Paragraphs, an essential primer on the basics of typography that focuses specifically on the role of printed text within a paragraph. I also want to mention that this book is available for purchase through the publisher Princeton Architectural Press, papress.com. Very easy website to remember. Cyrus Highsmith is a typographer, teacher, author, and graphic artist. He teaches type design at the Rhode School of Design and leads workshops and lectures frequently in the United States, Mexico, Europe, and Japan. His type foundry, Occupant Fonts, offers dozens of original typefaces, and clients include Rolling Stone, StarWars.com, Ford, La Prensa Grafica, Espan, and El Universal. In 2017, he became creative director for Latin type development at Morisa, USA. He has received awards from the Type Directors Club and AIGA. I also want to mention his website, occupantsfonts.com, which I think anyone who likes typefaces will really enjoy. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Cyrus Highsmith. Thank you, Cyrus.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and start my lecture. Great. Okay, I assume this is all working. Thank you very much to the General Society of Mechanics and Trades of the City of New York for inviting me to speak about my book. I really admire your organization's commitment to tuition-free technical education, and I'm sorry I can't visit you in person. I want to say a special hello to one of your board members, Penny Spector, whose husband, Martin, is the creator of the interrobang. The interrobang, as you can see, is a punctuation mark for expressing a question in an exclamatory manner. It's not exactly a standard punctuation mark, but it is included in Unicode, Microsoft Office, and system fonts like Lucida, Arial, and Calibri. Not too bad. So that's kind of a nice connection here. So tonight I'm going to tell you a bit about myself and my work, and of course talk about my book Inside Paragraphs and the process of writing it. Although I realize that writing isn't actually the correct word for how I made this book. My book was really as much drawn as it was written. And I'll go into a lot more detail about that later, but it's because I'm a graphic artist and a type designer. In other words, I do illustration and make prints, and I draw letters. Here's me in my studio. In addition to that, I'm a senior critic at Rhode Island School of Design, where I teach type design and typography. So I'll show you a little bit of my work before I get into inside paragraphs. I've illustrated a few children's books, one of my favorite things to do, including this book, Ari Inu Usagi, which is in Japanese, you can probably tell. Ari Inu Usagi is a primer for learning hiragana. The audience is Japanese children. Ari Inu Usagi means ant, dog, rabbit in English. So each hiragana character gets a page featuring an animal plus an adjective, both starting with that character. So it's an alphabet book, basically. My collaborator, Hiroko Sakumura, provided me with lists of the possible words for each character. I don't really speak Japanese, so this was, critical collaboration. And here you could see some of the drawings. There's a very polite Tyrannosaurus Rex. If I remember right, a happy python, a sloth who loves too much, a slimy moose, a stray cat, thirsty stray cat. One of the things I liked about this book was combining the animal with an adjective, because then it becomes kind of a story. Like, why is that bee so proud? What's the witch looking at? It's a fun project. The follow-up to that book is Iko Nihon Sanbiki, also created with Hiroko Sakumura. And this book is about counting. The title, Iko Nihon Sanbiki, kind of translates to 1, 2, 3. In Japanese, the pronunciation of numbers changes depending on the kinds of things you're counting. It's a bit similar to how in English we say one slice of bread or one loaf of bread, depending on the state of the bread that we're counting, except it's more complicated than that. For that reason, our book only goes up to 3, but each number represents a different kind of counter. So here's the first one with an apple, a tree, and a sheep, and some koalas, and 2 eggs, and 2 pencils, 3 squirrels with 3 mushrooms and 3 acorns. Here's one of my favorite spreads, 4 monkeys with 4 umbrellas and 4 hats. You could see I make these illustrations sort of by cutting out a lot of the shapes. And then I like to make the color separations myself and make it obvious the way the inks are layered. So I feel bad sometimes for the printers who make these books, because they have these state-of-the-art presses that can print extremely accurately and make all the colors line up exactly. But what I do is make the color separations by hand and make it look like it was printed kind of sloppily, because I kind of like that kind of printing. This spread, you can see that well, where the fox overlaps the background, or the watermelon is offset a little bit, and the inks overlaying on top of each other create new colors. And I remember seeing books like this when I was a kid, and being really interested in how printing worked. So that's part of why I do this. I just like this kind of effect, and who knows, maybe this will inspire the next generation of printmakers, as well as teaching kids how to count. But it's thanks to projects like these that I'm slowly learning Japanese, and they really do reflect my level of literacy and fluency. It's about the level of a 3 or 4-year-old. So if there are any Japanese speakers in the audience and I explained anything wrong about the way the counting or something works, I apologize. I'm very much a novice at that language. But it was a fun project. I really like making children's books. So my approach to drawing is very much influenced by my background as a printmaker, and I still do a lot of printmaking. Here's a series of prints that I've been working on lately in my studio. These are relief prints made with styrofoam plates. I like this way of working very much because it's very quick and cheap and easy and fast. And then again, it involves cutting. So you can probably see some similarities to these images to the kinds of drawings that I do for the children's books. And then now are some screen prints. That's what I'm very interested in lately. And these are made with paper stencils. So I don't have to burn the screen using any chemicals. Again, it's a very fast and cheap and quick printing method. And that's what I like to do. And I really like the way printing changes the drawings that I make. Part of it is thanks to the transformative nature of the process. But part of it, I think, also comes from seeing multiple copies of the same image. This kind of repetition changes things somehow. I think sometimes it's similar to what happens in music. But however it works, I really like mechanical reproduction. And I really like drawing art, making art for mechanical reproduction in mind. So in that sense, type design is kind of an extension of my interest in printmaking. All these A's are from typefaces that Occupant Fonts has produced. So typography is all about repetition and mechanical reproduction. A page of text is composed of thousands of tiny prefabricated drawings. That's one way to look at it. So Occupant Fonts, as Karen said in the introduction, is my type foundry. Many of my designs were developed while I was working at Font Bureau. I worked there for many years, and I worked a lot with newspapers and magazines, especially in Latin America. I had a lot of clients in Latin America. I've also drawn typefaces for video games, books, really anything with letters. I once drew a set of numbers for a speedometer. That was an interesting project. So in 2017, Occupant Fonts was acquired by Morisawa, a type company based in Osaka, Japan. Morisawa started as a photo typesetting manufacturer. They've been around for almost 100 years. Here's a photo of only half of their employees. This is a group photo of half of their employees. And here's a photo of me and my coworkers. So we're a much smaller part of this organization. So that's Marie Otsuka on the left. She's a designer. Jem Eskenazi, designer. Nick Schumann in the middle is our project manager. There's myself. And then finally on the right is Jun Shin, another type designer. So we usually work out of a co-working space in downtown Providence, Rhode Island. There we are. Of course, this is all in the past. This is what our office looks like now. We're at home, doing things over Slack and Google and Zoom. And it's not the most flattering image of us all, but that's what life is like these days, I guess. So yeah, we're coping though. We're all doing our best. So now I'll talk about my book, Inside Paragraphs, typographic fundamentals. It's about what goes on inside a paragraph of text. It was first published in 2012 by my former employer, Font Bureau. In 2020, Princeton Architectural Press published the second edition, which I'm super excited about. And the distribution is much greater, and we're reaching so many more people. I'm really happy about this. The book begins with a general explanation about how type works and how we read. Then it steps through the different kinds of space within a paragraph. And finally, it puts everything together in chapters about paragraph settings. A paragraph of printed text is where typography started from. Since then, typography is involved in all sorts of directions, often leaving print behind entirely. But I think understanding what goes on inside a paragraph of printed text is still the starting point for learning about typography. The book grew out of a lecture series I created at RISD for our beginning level typography course. I started the lecture series in 2005 and kept revising it every year as I was teaching. Sometimes it would change a little. Other years I would rewrite the whole thing completely. But what was valuable about that was I gradually realized that the way I could teach typography was to teach it from my point of view as a type designer. And then taking that even further, I realized that I could teach more specifically based on my own approach to type design. When I'm drawing letters, I'm very focused on white space or negative space. And I think about how all the different kinds of space work together in terms of spatial relationships. It's a kind of systems thinking approach, maybe. But changing the way I was teaching was an epiphany of sorts. It meant teaching in a way that felt more natural to me instead of just repeating the ways I had been taught. No, I had some good teachers that I learned a lot from, but I think it's important for things to evolve. So at the core of this book is the idea of glyph space. A paragraph has two basic visual elements, the black parts and the white parts. The black parts are the letters, and then the white is the background. But instead of thinking of them as separate layers like ink and paper, you can imagine the black parts and the white parts together like pieces of a puzzle. The black letters are arranged to form words, which are arranged to form the lines. And then the white elements, the other puzzle pieces, are the white spaces within the letter, or the counter space, the white space between the letters, the letter space, the white space between the words, or the word space, and the white space between the lines, or the line space. So I like to imagine way back in 1450 when Johann Gutenberg was inventing movable type in Europe. Movable type had been, brass letters had been used in Korea before Gutenberg had invented movable type, but it's unlikely that anyone in Europe knew about that invention. But probably Gutenberg was second when it comes to the invention of movable type. But I like to imagine what he was thinking back then. And I imagine him looking at a paragraph of text that looked a lot like this one. It would have been written in a style of calligraphy called textura. And I like to imagine him considering the counter space, the letter space, and the line space. Every paragraph, whether it's written or printed, has these kinds of white spaces in it. They don't have to be thought of in isolation, though. Gutenberg's idea was to attach a certain amount of each kind of space to the letter. With this innovation, he created a new kind of space, the glyph space. The glyph space forms the box around each letter that makes it easy to move and rearrange. This is the foundation of movable type and its future. We still use this same basic concept for typesetting today. So as I said, the counter space is the fully or partially enclosed white space inside a letter. Letter space is the white space between letters. It's like a puzzle piece that connects them together. Line space is the white space between the lines. A certain amount of space can be thought of as belonging to the line above, and a certain amount belongs to the line below. The glyph space is the block of white space surrounding the letter. It's formed by attaching the counter space, the letter space, and the line space to that letter. Now, if you're familiar with typography, or if you've done typesetting, you may have encountered the term body when referring to the boxes that surround each letter. And in fact, you could use the terms glyph space and body more or less interchangeably. When discussing foundry type, metal type, cold metal type, body is commonly used and refers to the actual piece of metal around stuff. I use the term glyph space because I think it's helpful when discussing the space within the paragraph. I think it helps put all the kinds of spaces in context. So thinking about white space or negative space is not specific to typography or even calligraphy. It's a very basic part of two-dimensional design. Glyph space, however, is solely a typographic concept. It's the mechanism that makes movable type possible. The glyph space forms a typeface's built-in spacing, and that built-in spacing is the starting point for the structure of a paragraph. With each kind of white space, there's a delicate balance between too much and too little. And when you look at them separately, it can be hard to understand where that balance lies. But in the context of a paragraph, it can be easier to see what's going on. The different kinds of white space in a paragraph don't exist in isolation. They have a hierarchical relationship based on size. And you can see that in this diagram. The letter space is the smallest, the line space is the biggest, and the word space is somewhere in between. And no matter what adjustments the typographer makes to the paragraph, it's almost always critical that this hierarchy remains intact. And the typographer's job then consists largely of adjusting the size of the white spaces, adding and subtracting distance between all these blocks to suit the text and the document they're composing. So as a paragraph gets wider, the typographer often lets all the space expand. And as a column of text gets narrower, the typographer often compacts everything a little bit tighter so the tempo increases. A beginner can find all these different kinds of white space within a paragraph a little overwhelming and feel maybe even paralyzed by the knowledge that adjusting one kind of white space has an effect on all the others. That's the downside of thinking of things as a hierarchy. And it can be easier to simply focus on the black letters and not worry about the white space at all. But what I tell my students is you're not alone. Typographers can think of composing type as a collaboration between themselves and their chosen typeface. The typeface's built-in spacing forms the basic structure of the paragraph, and that's your starting point. Then the typographer tunes the paragraph settings to suit the text and the document. Typographic adjustments are often subtle, especially to the untrained eye. And this is always important to acknowledge. Good typography, though, I believe, does more than make text legible. It can add depth and character to the presentation. In this sense, I like to think of typography as another part of the story. Being able to see and understand the structure of a paragraph of printed text is the foundation for learning the art of typography. The typographer's understanding of white space extends from the paragraph to the rest of the page, from the gutter between the columns to the margins that surround them. Then, when setting different kinds of documents and working in different media, the typographer acquires additional skills and vocabulary. All these things build on the foundation of what I write about in this book. And that's what the goal of this book is. It's not the only book you need about typography. It's the foundation book about typography. It's the book that I wish I had when I was a student in my very first typography course. So when I sat down to to write this book, I sat down at my desk and I had a unwelcome epiphany. I realized I really don't want to write a book about typography. What I really wanted to do was draw a comic book about typography. I'll be honest, things were not going well during this process, and I was having very serious doubts about my ability to actually write a book. I didn't really think a comic book about typography would work, but I was stuck. And since I'm a drawer, I'm a graphic artist, I figured, well, I should at least give it a try. Who knows what'll happen? So I quickly started to sketch what it might look like. And those sketches were a turning point. I stopped being trapped by the typography book that I thought I should write and began working on the one that I could write. So Inside Paragraphs is not a comic book for sure, but it is a very visual book. It's the result of lots of drawing and scribbling and doodling on big sheets of paper and pacing around and drinking a lot of coffee. Without Font Bureau's support, I don't think this book would have happened, both in the sense of, them fronting the money to publish it, the first edition, but also just giving me the space to figure out how to write the book that I had inside me. So thanks to this kind of visual process, the book kind of became, it was my path for writing it. It wasn't easy, but it became a process that I could use. When I had trouble illustrating something, it was often because the corresponding text wasn't clear enough. And if I couldn't find the right words for what I was trying to write about, the illustration usually needed more work as well. So it was very circular, but this circular process helped break down these complicated concepts into smaller and smaller and simpler pieces. So the result is a book where the diagrams illustrate the text and the text explains the diagrams. And that might seem redundant, but as a teacher, I've found the more different ways you can explain something, the better your students will understand it. The book's emphasis on fundamentals means it will remain relevant despite changes in software and technology. So as I said, this is a very visual book. There's a diagram on pretty much every spread. And you can look at it in three ways. You can look at just the illustrations and diagrams on the left. You can read just the text on the right, or you can do both. Personally, I'd start by just looking at the pictures. It's a little bit like listening to an old Ramones record or a Beach Boys record where they're recorded in mono. If you play with the balance on your speakers, you can listen to just the drums and the bass, just the guitars and the vocals. But really for best effect, you probably should put the balance in the middle and listen to both. But because of this visual approach, I encountered a funny design problem: how to illustrate typography. I didn't want to typeset the illustrations because I wanted them to stand out from the text. So I tried something more like lettering, but that looked too much like lettering or calligraphy, which distracted from the message. It didn't look like type. And to be honest, I'm not a very good calligrapher. So I drew the type in the illustrations, and I gave it a bit of a rough edge to signal that it's part of the diagram and not the text. So I think of them, and I think of them this way. I think of them as diagrams. The goal with them is to explain the typographic concepts that I write about, instead of just being examples of typeset different ways or catalogs of typography assignments, which is what a lot of type books are. So I drew all the type in this book, although I used some tricks, of course. And then in keeping with the hand-drawn nature of the illustrations, I also hand lettered all the captions. Of course, to set the type, I wanted to use some of my own typefaces. So I used Ibis for the body copy. The serif is a series called Ibis Text. And then sans serif used for the running heads and the things like that is a sans serif called Scout. So really, in every way, I drew this book as much as I wrote it. In fact, I drew everything in the book except for the barcode on the back and the author photo. So I missed a chance there. Maybe in the third edition, I will rectify that. Here's some of my favorite diagrams from the book. This one is to explain about letter space and the puzzle piece. Drawing this one was, figuring this out was one of the kind of breakthrough drawings in this process, with using the gray background and the white shapes and the black letters. This is when I really started to be able to visualize what the book would look like when I did this drawing. This diagram is explaining about how to do optical letter spacing, which is the trick that you use to get the appearance of an even pacing of even rhythm of letters in a word. And the way you do it is you look at letters in groups of three, and overlapping groups of three, and in each group of three you try to visually center the letter in the middle. I read so many typography books where they talk about the importance of even optical letter spacing, but fail to explain how to actually do it in a concrete way, except just to say, you use your eye. Well, yeah, you use your eye, but what do you do with your eye when you use it? So I like this drawing. This explains tracking, which is when you add or subtract space between the add or subtract letter space to words or lines of text at a time. I like arrows a lot. I use a lot of arrows in this book. You can see that. Here's a diagram of the eye. This one reminds me of those maps I used to see in documentaries about World War II when I was a kid, like the Why We Fight series with the arrows moving across maps and things like that. It reminds me of that. In this case, it's just a diagram of the eye, though it's a little hard to tell zoomed in this far. Here's one of my favorite parts of the eye with three arrows coming out of it, kind of alien looking. This is an important illustration because it shows the spacing hierarchy in a paragraph. And those blocks became very important because those blocks allowed me to illustrate the different effects of changing the paragraph setting and how that affects the hierarchy. And here's blocks plus arrows. So two of my favorite things. So condensing the development process like this, this book took me a few years to write. When I say it out loud, when I tell the story, I wonder sometimes if it sounds easy. It wasn't easy. In fact, I think this was probably, for me, one of the most challenging projects of my entire career, and also one of the most rewarding personally. And in the first edition, I did not give enough credit to its editor, Anna Galloway Highsmith. Not only did Anna provide support and insight during the book's long development process, she picked apart and improved every sentence. She made my writing make sense. So this book could not have been finished without her. The reaction to the book has been mostly very positive, I'm happy to say. Many teachers have said to me, They really appreciate how clearly it explains concepts that they've struggled to explain. So that's nice to hear. That's very gratifying. Reaction from students is sometimes different. It's usually something more like, yeah, well, duh. I think students are sometimes expecting typography to be more complicated, and it is complicated. This book is just a foundation. There's a lot that I leave out. Nevertheless, I take it as a good sign that someone can read it quickly, and it doesn't seem too overwhelming. But the most gratifying reaction has been all the different translations of the book. The first foreign edition was in Japanese, and this was in thanks large part to one of my colleagues, type designer Akira Kobayashi, who works for Linotype. So he helped make the connections between myself and a publisher, Graphic Shaw, in Japan. And the Morisawa company also played a role in backing it. So at first I was confused because I thought, you know that my book's about Latin typography, not about Japanese. They're very different writing systems. And they said, yes, of course we know that. I mean, of course they knew that. But there's a lot of interest in Latin typography in Japan. So Latin typography is still the topic. Just the text was translated into Japanese. So here's one of the illustrations. You can see that my captions have been replaced with Japanese. And at one point I had offered to do a version where I replaced my drawings with manga characters. Here's one of my favorite mangas, Astro Boy. Thinking it might appeal to Japanese readers more, but the publisher said, no, that's fine. We'll just use yours. This was followed by a French edition. You can see here, and Spanish, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and Polish. There's also a Taiwanese edition in traditional Chinese, and a Thai edition is in the works. So here's some details from the Polish edition. And as these images go by, you can see there's some drawbacks to the way I designed the book. I don't think I would do it any differently, knowing what I know now, but I didn't anticipate the issues that would come up. Because the illustrations need to be translated as well as the text. In addition, because the text is so connected to the illustrations, the content on each spread is fixed. Word count usually increases or decreases in a translation depending on the languages that you're translating. For this book, however, the word count had to remain pretty consistent. There's some room for error, but on some spreads, really not much at all. So I didn't anticipate this when I made the original book, and I'm really impressed with each publisher did really a good job recreating a lot of these illustrations. So I also had to make a typeface for the captions based on my hand lettering. I wasn't up for re-lettering all the illustrations in each translation. Fortunately, I had help from my good friend Juan Carlos Casacin. He helped me by automating the process of digitizing my lettering and making it into a typeface. Then he added some very smart programming to that digital font that randomizes the letter shapes. So the result is a bit stiffer than my original lettering, but overall, I think it has a pretty natural feel to it. I like how it looks. One detail, though, from the English edition that ended up working out really well, though, relates to the text I used in a lot of the illustrations. When I needed to illustrate a paragraph of text, I needed some fake text to set it in. So I didn't want to use lorem ipsum, which is like kind of a classic fake text thing that the computer can generate. It looks kind of like Latin. And I didn't want to use just gibberish. What I ended up doing is I chose 20,000 text from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, in part because I happened to be reading it at the time. I was working on the book, and I kind of liked the story. It's a classic story, of course. And also it's in the public domain, so there were no copyright problems. And as it turns out, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and almost all of Jules Verne's work has been translated already into dozens of different languages. The originals are in French, of course. And these are also in the public domain. So all the editions use this text, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, for the illustrations in the correct language. I mean, I'm the only one who knows this. Now well, besides all of you, now you know it too. Doesn't really matter all that much, but I like that. I like that detail that is consistent. Juan Carlos also played a role in the Spanish edition from Typographic. The majority of the translation was done by our friend Miguel Anton, but Juan Carlos helped with some of the more technical vocabulary. And the three of us are friends, so it was kind of a fun project. I speak enough Spanish to have opinions about the translation while they were doing it, but not really actually enough to be helpful. But it led to some very interesting conversations. There are big differences between Latin American Spanish and European Spanish. Miguel and Juan Carlos are both from Spain. The Spanish I speak is somewhere in between. I call it mid-Atlantic Spanish. And I sound funny to everyone. So I was curious how their Spanish sounded to a Latin American. So I asked a student of mine from Puerto Rico to read a draft, and he said overall, yeah, it sounded fine. Like he could tell it was European Spanish, but he did point out that the word we used for tight letter spacing was very rude and very racist slang in Puerto Rico, and also Mexico too, I learned. Now, none of us were aware of this. This word was absolutely not used this way in Spain. And obviously, you know, Miguel and Juan Carlos and I were horrified. So we were able to, we thought, well, we had to change it. And unfortunately, it was quite easy to change. So we found a different word and it was fine. Other words were trickier. Some of the technical terms we had trouble translating. For example, how do you translate the word kerning? This is a very specific typographic word, and it refers to adjusting the letter spacing between a pair of characters. And in the end, we used the word in Spanish, acoplamiento. And this is the correct word, but sounds to most Spanish speakers very old-fashioned and almost a little strange. You know, and when I worked with a lot of clients in Latin America, we all just said kerning or kerning. But I like that we found the actual word for this. And the publisher felt quite strongly about that we should use the correct term. So we did that. And Juan Carlos and Miguel and I were all still friends. The Polish edition was published by Jacek Morawczyk. And I think this is the reason I'm showing it now is it's, I think, the most well-produced of all the translated editions, in large part thanks to Jacek. And I had an interesting experience with Jacek, because my understanding from him is that my original English text was challenging to translate into Polish, in large part because my writing style is so repetitive. I do this for clarity, but also as a way to teach the vocabulary. However, according to Jacek, whose first language is Polish, this kind of repetition sounds very strange in Polish. And Polish is a very word-rich language. It has a lot of words that mean the same thing, but there are limits. So this meant Jacek and I had to go through the text and figure out the most important instances of each word. So it's a really interesting lens that we use to kind of re-examine my original writing. But my favorite part of Jacek's suggestions was to make the cover more illustrative. This is the original cover from the first edition, and he wanted something more in the really beautiful graphic, illustrative tradition of graphic design in Poland. So I redid the cover and I drew this image that I think of as the masked typographer. And I reused this idea, of course, for the new edition from Princeton Architectural Press. But my favorite translated edition is this one. This is from this is in Persian, the language spoken in Iran. I was contacted by Farzaneh Aryan, a designer in Iran, who wanted to make a translation of my book for her students. Now, between the sanctions between Iran and the United States and the lack of copyright treaties and the very small audience for a book like this, it really didn't make sense to do this formally. Basically, I gave my blessing to make an unauthorized translation, an unauthorized edition of my book in Iran, in the spirit of peace and cooperation between colleagues. And you know, here's an example. One of my favorite things about this edition is they added some new illustrations using letters from the Arabic alphabet. I'm not sure I'm using exactly the right terminology. Persian is written with the Arabic alphabet. It's not Arabic, it's Persian. It's a different language. So here you can see my original illustration explaining letter spacing, and then it being explained again, but with these Arabic letters for the Persian language. So I was really impressed with this. This all started, this correspondence between myself and the designer in Iran started, I think in 2015 or 16. It took a really long time. And then finally in January 2017, I got an email from the Iranian publisher that they were mailing me some copies of the book. It had been printed and they were mailing. So if you think back to January 2017, you can imagine this was kind of a dark time for a lot of us in the United States. And I was quite doubtful that I would ever see these books. I imagined them arriving in US Customs and then seeing all the Iranian stamps and lettering, and it would just be destroyed on site. But in fact, it showed up a few weeks later on the very day that I was in my studio printing this sign for a protest against the Muslim travel ban and the idiotic border wall between the United States and Mexico. So I thought, good timing. I liked kind of poetic timing, and it reminds me that people can still work together. So all these translated editions are a testament really to the Latin alphabet's global reach. But it's also thanks to the place where much of this content was developed. My classroom at Rhode Island School of Design. This was really the laboratory that I used for explaining and refining my ideas about typography. The students at RISD and the faculty come from all over the world. They bring with them their experiences in multiple languages and writing systems. So I'm really grateful for how this diversity shaped this book and continues to shape my own professional practice. Basic awareness of typography is valuable for every reader. It can enhance their enjoyment of a well-set document and let them recognize when something is deliberately made difficult to read. Why would someone do that? Well, I think that, you know, the credit card company does. The credit card companies make their terms and conditions difficult to read. A social media company's privacy policy is deliberately hard to decipher. And we make important decisions every day based on things we read. Readers are entitled to information being presented in readable formats. In the big picture, typography doesn't seem very important compared to things like social justice and climate change and surviving a pandemic. And when typography is reduced to rules governing minutiae and inaccessible technical jargon, it sidelines the critical function that it can perform. And that function is communication. Communication in a manner that respects and elevates the audience. And that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Hello, Cyrus. Sorry, a little bit slow off the draw there. Cyrus, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to say a few more words at the end, but that was fascinating and so interesting to find out how about the translation of the different books and how you handled the typography for that. And also extraordinary to know that you hand drew the typography. You did everything in that book, apart from the barcode in your photograph. But anyway, we're going to take some questions now. So we'll take questions for 10 to 15 minutes. So I am going to start off with, this is a question from Jacob Ford. He says, Mr. Ford says, you're very specific about thinking of counters and ink as complementary parts, not layers. But your art is all about the opposite, intentionally offsetting and overlaying ink layers. Why the tension?
Ah, that's funny. I never thought about that. That's true. What I would say though is each layer, I mean, I talk about black and white shapes, right? But really they're any color you need them to be, right? Sometimes the foreground is red, sometimes the background is blue. So each layer is its own exploration of shape and negative space, and then I put them on top of each other and I flatten them on top of each other. That's a good observation, though. I had never thought about that.
The next question, this is from Abby Heller, and she says, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Who, what inspired you? Could you name your favorite type, stroke font, and the person or persons you admire in this field?
Like a lot of people in my generation, the first type designer I became aware of was Susanna Lichko. She was a type designer. She still is a type designer, but her work was published through Emigre, her type foundry, and that was a magazine too. And it was amazing. It was, this was in the 90s and early 2000s that her work was really prominent. And it looked totally different than other typefaces. That's kind of when I started really become aware of typefaces, because I saw these typefaces that didn't look like they were supposed to. And of course, all our teachers hated her typefaces. Now they like them, but they were very controversial at the time. So when you're a young student studying these things, that's of course what you're attracted to. So that's what really got me interested in making type, and kind of the awareness of that it was possible. Later, I became aware of the work of Rhode, a Dutch type designer who makes really beautiful, extremely usable and readable typefaces, but that look different and new. Yeah. And then, in terms of artists that I like, Ben Shawn, the printmaker and graphic artist, was a big influence on me. Paul Klee, there's Japanese artist Serizawa Keisuke, who does textiles and a lot of stencils. That's made a big impact on me. All sorts of people. My favorite typeface is Banco by Roger Excoffon. It's kind of a funny typeface. Where can you see it? It's the logo for Thrasher magazine, the skateboard magazine. You can see Banco. It's a beautiful typeface, and Roger Excoffon was a great type designer who kind of in every one of his typefaces, he breaks a rule for how to make typefaces. And Banco, the rule it breaks is that it's drawn like it looks like it's made out of pieces of metal or something. It's an amazing, imaginative, beautiful design. I think that was all the questions. In that,
I think you answered them all. This is from Siobhan Harrison. How much of your typography is determined upon a form of copperplate handwriting in whatever language, i.e. a sort of perfect aesthetic handwriting?
I've done one typeface called Novia. That was a revival. And that's that's the term we use when we look at a historical material and we try to kind of replicate it digitally. And that was based on English copperplate script. And I did that for Martha Stewart Living magazine, the weddings issues. So it's very traditional, very much, you look at it and you think, oh, well, that's for a wedding. That's the only design that I've done that's really directly connected to that style of lettering. In general, in terms of the connection between drawing typefaces and doing calligraphy, that's a really interesting question. And obviously our typographic letters are evolved from handwritten letters. So you can't ignore that connection. But what interests me about typographic letters is what makes them different from calligraphic letters. And what makes typographic letters different from calligraphic letters is that they're drawn for mechanical reproduction, and the space of a typographic letter is connected to it because of the glyph space. And that's what I really think about and explore when I'm drawing letters. Calligraphy is like the safety net that I use to make sure things are readable and look right. But my personal interest is in what makes typographic letters different from calligraphic letters.
Right. This is a very specific question. What fonts would you recommend to someone, and this is from Henry Russell, what font would you recommend to someone preoccupied with making clear visually the difference between a capital L, a lowercase l, and he uses Lima as an example, and the number 1, if you understand that?
Right, no, that's a great question because those letters can all look similar. My favorite there's a lot of typefaces that solve that problem. My personal favorite is a series called Input by David Jonathan Ross. And he drew it for setting code, right? If you're programming. And when you're writing code, the legibility for characters and being able to distinguish a 1 from an L or a 0 from an O is critical because it's code. And he did that very well. So when I need a typeface that I know will be clear, I really like Input.
This is a question from Abby Heller. What is the commonality among the languages in the country your book was published?
What is the commonality?
Among the languages in the different countries where your book was published?
Well, for most of the book, they all use the Latin alphabet, right? The Latin alphabet is what we use for English, but you know, as you know, it can be used to set you know, the Romance languages, Germanic languages, Slavic languages, Celtic languages. It's been adapted to set a lot of African languages. So Latin alphabet is used for you know, hundreds and hundreds of different languages, not just English, of course. And then in countries like Japan, there's a big interest in the Latin alphabet because the English is everywhere in Japan. The Latin alphabet, not just English, but European languages are everywhere. If you look at a magazine cover in Japan, you'll see the Latin alphabet all over the place. So it's a big part of Japanese typography. So there's an interest in that country, and I work in Japan a lot, so that's something I know about. Other countries like Thailand, where I didn't show that because I don't have examples of that. That edition is in the works now. That surprised me more because you don't see as much typeset in Latin in Thailand. But of course, you know, we live in a global, you know, everyone connected globally, of course. So there's still interest in the Latin alphabet. The one that surprised me the most was their Iranian edition. Like a lot of Americans, I don't know a lot about Iran because, you know, our countries have been, you know, almost at war for so long. So that really surprised me, that one. And I was so excited. At one point, I asked a lawyer, I said, you know, I want to say yes to this unauthorized edition. But is there, you know, is there a smart way we can do this legally? And he said, well, let me look into it. And he said, if you want to do this officially, you have to fill out paperwork, like a stack of paperwork this thick with the State Department. And he said, so just say okay, and it'll be fine. But the Latin alphabet is really, it's a global phenomenon.
Just a few more questions and comments. Jeffrey Bolden wants to know a little bit more about the glyph.
The glyph?
Yes, if I pronounce, yes.
The glyph space or just glyphs in general?
Well, he specifically said what is the ETYMO:OBY of glyph? But I wasn't quite sure what that meant.
Oh, maybe the etymology of glyph?
Oh, maybe that's what he means.
I don't know where that word comes from. Greek, maybe. I'm just guessing with that. A lot of times people use the word character and glyph interchangeably. Like we have the characters of the alphabet, but and then there's the glyphs. So there's a distinction in that you can have more than one version of a character. Like you can have an italic A that's slanted, a Roman A that's upright, a swash A that maybe has like some extra decorative parts. Those are all the same character, right? They're all A's, but they're all different glyphs. So the glyphs are the individual instances of a character, if that makes any sense.
Right, this is just a comment from Barbara Walker. In my youth, we talked about SLOIT, space left over in type. Is that a term you would be familiar with?
To be honest, it's not.
Okay, well there we go. I guess, Barbara, that term is no longer used. Vivian Top made a comment about websites when you visit them, and it's a bit like what you were saying about the credit cards, but of course credit cards don't, as you don't necessarily want you to read the small type, but she does find that sometimes when you visit websites that the typeface can be too small and how discouraging that can be. So yes, just like, yeah, but it is what it, yes. And this is our basically it's our final comment, and I can only echo. This is from an anonymous attendee. That was wonderful, sir. How I wish I'd had this book when I was learning letterpress.
Great. Well, that's nice to hear.
Yeah, so that seemed a very kind of fitting comment to conclude. So Cyrus, thank you so much. I was like, I wrote that you to talk really about this paragraph hierarchy. That was you've explained quite complex things in a way so eloquently and so beautifully, and of course supported by your wonderful illustrations. And I have to say that your wonderful children's books illustrations were quite breathtaking. Anyway, it was a wonderful overview of type and paragraphs, particularly for someone like myself who would be very unknowledgeable about those topics. So on behalf of myself, I want to thank you so much for participating in our lecture series tonight. And I would like to now introduce Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director, who would also like to say a few words.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Cyrus, and for being a part of our series, our Artisan Lecture series. And as a person whose 100-year-old best friend, that's 100, actually she's 100 and a half, Penny Spector, who had decades in the business of advertising and typeface, and I've had so many lessons from her in terms of this topic. And thanks to her and your lecture, I just never look at words on the page in the same way. And so thank you for that. And I do want to say that Karen, did you want to mention Cyrus's book?
Yes, I want to remind, I thank you very much, Victoria. I want to remind our audience that this wonderful book that so comprehensively explains typeface and paragraphs is for sale through Princeton Architectural Press. And just to remind you, and in fact, we're going to put up a slide with the link with that. Thank you, Angelo. And but also you can just go to papress.com and you'll be able to find that book. So I can only say what a wonderful gift for someone who's interested in typeface. I also want to remind you to visit Cyrus's website, and perhaps you could remind me what that is again, Cyrus.
Occupantfonts.com.
Thank you. So also again, because there's some really absolutely marvelous typeface there. So in conclusion, I want to thank Princeton Architectural Press again for their assistance. Cyrus, I just want to thank you for really what was a really wonderful overview of typology, and to again say how much we appreciate it. And again, that was really lovely, as Victoria mentioned, that you singled out the interrobang by the husband of our 100-year-old volunteer and board member, Penny Spector, and that is much appreciated. And you, our audience, thank you so much for attending. I just want to mention the lecture we have coming up in 2 weeks, and that's on Tuesday, December 15th, and it's with John Taranak. And it's about mapping the subway. So with that, I am going to say good evening and to remind you again about this fantastic book, Inside Paragraphs. Cyrus, it was a pleasure. And Cyrus, we look forward to one day when welcoming you into the General Society.
I look forward to that
also. I hope you'll be able to visit when those days beckon again. So again, thank you so much. And I'm going to say good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.